Hey guys, my name is Graham Johnson, and welcome back to Tabletop Glory. Now today we're going to be doing some basing, and that's mostly because it's actually been a popular request for a while. However, it's kind of hard for me to just come up with themes off the top of my head, and I was waiting for a lot of you guys to leave suggestions in the comments. However, it seems that you guys just want to see whatever I come up with. So there isn't really any plan for today's video, although you can see the 4 bases on screen that I was able to accomplish. We'll talk about the different methods involved in making bases like that, and how you can easily apply that to basing your entire army. Let's get on with the video. So the gray things you see in front of me aren't necessarily bases on their own. They are what are known as base toppers. These are something that you're meant to glue onto your base. Now with these GW ones, you have to glue them on upside down just because the base of the base is the true size that they're supposed to be for the game. But yeah, you just glue them on in place, and they're just really nice decorative base toppers. Now, if you don't own a 3D printer, they can be kind of expensive to purchase when you're trying to purchase them across an entire army. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't purchase some. I would highly encourage you to purchase a few and then try to replicate similar effects across your entire army so they all kind of blend together. Now, as you can see, I'm showing you a lot of the things that I use for base building. These little half pearls are really great for like bubbles when you're trying to do something like a lava base. But anyway, I'm going to be trying to replicate this stair-step effect on a base, just so that if we were to use something like this, all your miniatures would be approximately the same size, and it would all kind of blend together and look like it belongs. Now, typically I would encourage you to use something like balsa wood and then just shave it down to the appropriate size, but these little biscuit pieces, they're like joiners for putting together 2 pieces of wood. They happen to be the right size when stacking them up naturally on their own, so it works out just fine for me. We're also going to be using this coffee stir stick to kind of hide the fact that this is just a bunch of layers all kind of glued together. Now, if you didn't have something like that, you could use cardstock and just glue it along the face of it to kind of help hide the fact that this is multiple things glued together. You could also use cardboard for something like this just to build up, and I really encourage you to get creative with what you have available to you when it comes to decorating your miniature bases. Now you'll notice I'm just basically gluing down the whole piece, and then I'm using these old clippers here to kind of remove the bulk of the material, and I'll come back in with a Dremel and actually clean this up later and get it much closer to what it needs to be. Now if you don't have tools like a rotary tool like a Dremel, you may find that you want to hold it in place, draw a line with a pencil, cut it off of the base, and then glue down the piece that you want to keep. Just keep in mind that we're trying to make this as easy for ourselves as possible because we're going to be doing this across an entire army. There's no sense in making something super convoluted and then kind of burning yourself out because you've made your job here significantly more difficult than it needs to be. Now, like I'm saying, in my case here, I've been very fortunate that these coffee stir sticks are exactly 3 of these little pieces of wood high. And if you were using something like a popsicle stick or something like that, you may want to adjust certain materials in order to make your life a lot easier, as opposed to like cutting down some things repeatedly, having tons of waste, etc., etc. Again, like I keep saying, we're trying to replicate this across an entire army. So although this is a test piece to see if it works and to see if we like it, our next step is to try and simplify this in a way where we're not going to just burn ourselves out doing this across an entire army. Now here I'm just using Kicker as well as super glue to kind of affix everything in place. Now I'm not super concerned about getting everything coated. I just want to tack this down and make sure it's not going to go anywhere when I go to clean it up later with the Dremel. Now if you are cutting all your pieces ahead of time and then gluing them in place, you could probably use wood glue or a PVA glue to lock everything down instead of using tons of super glue like I am. But because I need it to be locked down and in place when I go to cut it with the Dremel, it's better for me to use super glue right here. So with the way that I'm joining the coffee stir sticks together, I'm planning to use some green stuff to fill any gaps that I may have. Now, if you don't want to take that route, you may want to cut these stir sticks at like a 45-degree angle, similar to how a picture frame is made, so that when they butt up, there's less of a seam there. But for me, it's not a really big deal. I just cut them off as close as I can, and then I use this X-Acto knife that is a flat edge, and I kind of get everything as smooth and as clean as possible, and then I just throw some green stuff in there and call it a day. Alright, now this could look good just the way it is, but we're going to simulate this little lip that we see hanging out over the edge of the stairs simply by adding another one of these planks and letting it overhang a little bit. Now it's important to make sure that overhang is on both sides, and we want to line this up as best as we can so that we don't have to trim down a ton later. Now I do end up having to do a little bit of trimming to get one of the sides to fit the way that I want it, but in the end it works out just fine. Just remember, this is one of those measure twice, cut once type of situations where we want to try and make sure that we get this right the first time. So take your time, make sure you get everything lined up the way you want it. So here you can see me using a Dremel tool. This is called a cutoff wheel, and I am doing exactly what you shouldn't be doing with it. I am killing two birds with one stone. So I cut off all the excess. You can see a little piece sitting on the table there. And then I'm grinding away and just rounding that out so it matches the curvature of the base. And then I'm going to smooth that out with a little bit of green stuff later. So let's replicate this tile effect. You have a few different options, but number one, we need to figure out roughly about how large they are. Now in this case, they're 1 centimeter square, so that makes things pretty easy. Number one of the things we could use is a brass sheet. Now I've got a little piece of brass sheet here that we're going to use. I'm going to show you how I would kind of measure it all out and cut out the pieces, but ultimately I end up using polystyrene sheet and gluing everything down with a mixture of super glue and hobby glue. Now the reason I use polystyrene sheet is because it's significantly thinner, it's a little bit easier to work with. If you can afford it, go online, find it on eBay. It's super cheap, it's super affordable. Hopefully I'm going to have a link for you guys soon, and won't have it available in time for this video, but I'll update the description as soon as I have a link available. But as for the brass sheeting, I recommend holding it down with your ruler and using the back side of your razor blade. The reason I recommend using the back side is it will reduce the chance of dulling the razor blade, or you can use a dull razor blade or a nail or something. This is basically just to scratch the surface so you can tell where you need to cut. Go ahead and make your 1 centimeter marks all the way in one direction, and then flip it sideways, make them in the other direction, and then basically just connect all the lines up and get yourself a nice little grid pattern. Now it's important to remember when working with brass sheeting, we want to be using tin snips to cut them. Now this is going to result in them not necessarily being flat, so you'll need to flatten them down with something. In my case, I use the back side of my ruler just to push them back down flat again. Now if you don't have tin snips and you can't afford tin snips, you can use a really nice pair of scissors. I recommend putting them as far back in the jaws as you can to get as clean a cut as you can, but it is going to ruin those scissors very, very quickly. One thing to keep in mind if you decide to continue forward with tin or copper or whatever sheet that you decide to use as opposed to the styrene sheet is that with metal it's going to be sharp, especially when using tin snips, so you are going to need to use some kind of file to file down those edges to make it safe to handle. If you're using this for a piece for like a display or a diorama, it may not be as important, but for when using it as a gaming piece where people are going to be touching it and someone other than you may pick up the model and thumb over it, you want to make sure that they're not going to cut themselves on it. Now you're going to have to use super glue when attaching brass to your miniature. It's just the nature of it. There are other glues you can use. I recommend super glue though. And when it comes to our styrene sheet, remember that you can only use plastic glue with plastic on plastic. So other than that, you're going to have to use other glues like super glue or other alternatives. Now with the metal sheets, we're going to go ahead and scuff up the side that we want to glue down. That's going to help the glue stick to the metal sheet, and it's going to help it stick to the miniature. And then it's important to keep in mind when putting down these little tiles, we want to kind of make sure that everything lines up in a grid pattern, so that way when we put the tiles on the stair step above it, it also lines up with the stair step below it. So that way we can kind of tile and keep the patterns going in the direction that they need to. Now, if you're wanting to add some weathering to the steps, maybe you want to put a gouge or a chip or a big scratch mark in it, now is the time to add those things so that we can plan around them as we add the tiles to that step. It also is a great time to add it now because we're not dealing with any primers or sealant or anything that is going to have to then be resealed again once you cut it open. If you're working with polystyrene or you're working with styrofoam in this case, you would need to seal it with something like Mod Podge. So if you're cutting in past that layer, you're going to have to re-add Mod Podge to seal it again. So we might as well do any cuts and gouges as we're doing our building phase. When we work with styrene sheets like this, it's actually quite easy. We only really need to score it once. We don't have to cut all the way through it, and then you can just kind of snap it off. It's really nice, it's really pleasant to work with. Now you will see me just kind of chop all the way through it once I make my mark. But for the most part, this stuff is just really nice. You can just leave a nice little score and then snap the piece off. Now, because we're gluing this down to wood, we're going to be using super glue, but like I said, normally you'd be able to use plastic glue to lock down styrene to any of your model bits. So like if you were going to use a styrene rod to replace a sword handle, you could just glue that in place using plastic glue. Again, we're trying to recreate that pattern that we've already done down below, and we're trying to make sure all of our little squares line up. We're also going to use this to continue the pattern there on the left-hand side. You can see I've left that bare. Now, the cool thing about the styrene is it's nice and thin and easy to work with, which means I can just glue down a whole tab hanging off the edge and then cut away the excess once the glue dries. Now is the perfect opportunity to go ahead and add any little extra details that you want. In my case, I'll be adding some little gun magazines. Now, the one you see me attaching right now, I end up deciding is a bit too large, and I do remove it and add a smaller one, which you'll see during the painting process later. I'm using a product here that I've designed called Sprue Goo. Sprue Goo is not a new invention, but the consistency of mine is unique to myself. Essentially what it is it's plastic sprue that has been melted down in plastic glue until it gets this thick consistency. It's really great for filling gaps. So anytime you're gluing parts together that don't quite fit just right, you can kind of use this to not only fill those gaps, but to also make sure that it gets good adhesion between all of the parts. It's really great for stuff like this for basing and things. But yeah, as you can see, it's not really sticking down quite right. And then I put this little one on, and I do end up moving it just so that there'll be more space to attach a Space Marine later. So if you want to add some bullet casings to your displays, dioramas, or even your bases in this case, I'm using wire. Now in my case I'm using 20mm wire, and that seems to be about the right size casing for the bullets I'm attempting to replicate. Now keep in mind, if you're trying to do this for Warhammer 40k, the bullet fired out of a bolter with the shell is a little bit larger than a Monster can. Monster energy drink. I mean, they're freaking massive. So you're probably going to want to use something significantly larger than what I'm using. But this works just fine for my purposes. So I'm going to be cutting off little tiny pieces of this wire, and then I'm going to file them down to get them nice and flat, and then we'll paint them brass colored for their final effect. Unfortunately, with our bullet casings, we are going to have to use super glue to lock those down. If you do use Sprue Goo, it can work, but I've also seen them come up with age, meaning that the more people that handle them, they'll eventually come back off. So the trick, you can see me here, making sure I get the super glue nice and flat so you won't be able to see it when you paint it, is before it dries, take the back side of your razor blade and just scrape it down clean. Now I'm using a modeling epoxy putty. This is known as gray stuff. It's basically the exact same thing as green stuff, it just has a different drying time. And you smear it around using some water, and that kind of helps to get rid of any fingerprints or anything that's on it. I'm using this to fill up all the gaps in my process. Normally I would say in the molding, if I was like making a model, I would use this to fill any gaps, like where a shoulder doesn't quite line up with the rest of the torso. In this case, I'm using it to fill up any gaps where all our little different wood pieces don't quite line up. And I'm also using that to help smear around on the back side of this little stair step as well, to kind of help flatten everything out and make it look proper. I want to go ahead and put a little bit of basing paste. Now in this case, this is Sterling Battlemire. Essentially it's just kind of a rough texture that I can go ahead and put around. Now if you have a Vallejo ground texture, that's pretty much the same thing, just dye it brown with some brown paint. And we're just going to go ahead and smear that into all our cracks, as well as put a little bit in, kind of like a grout in between all of the lines. It's okay if you get a little bit on the tiles as well, but just do your best to kind of overall clean it up and get it off any raised surfaces or vertical surfaces. And that should help to really create some interesting texture when we go to paint the whole thing later. Now before we get to painting that one, I'm going to go ahead and let everything dry, and that gives us plenty of time to work on a couple of more ideas. Another idea is simply utilizing pieces you already have. You don't want to spend money on buying things like base toppers or the materials to replicate base toppers. We can simply buy a couple of really cheap little extra things. In this case, I'm using the styrene I-beam from the same company as the styrene sheets from earlier, Evergreen. And we're just going to go ahead and chop this off, and then we're going to cut it at a bit of an angle to allow it to sit not quite flat. What we're then going to do is attach that door from a tank, I believe it is. I don't think it's from a Land Raider. I think it's just from a Rhino tank. And we're going to attach that door to this base, and that's going to create an elevated platform that would be excellent for any kind of banner bearer or captain or any kind of a named character you want to draw a little bit more attention to. It's just going to raise them up just enough that they're going to kind of put themselves out there and be slightly taller than the other miniatures on the table, and it'll really make them pop that much more. So once again, we're going to be relying on our friend Sprue Goo, and we're going to be pretty ham-fisted with it this time, because we want to make sure that not only does this get a good connection, but that there's plenty of goop for it to hold on to. If you were just use a little bit of plastic glue right along the ledge or right along the edge and glue it down, it's not going to have a lot really holding it in place. Again, if you don't have Sprue Goo in this case, you could just goop a ton of super glue on there, and it would probably do the same thing. But because Sprue Goo is basically just melted plastic, we're creating a nice strong bond, and we're creating a big footprint for it to hold itself down to the base on. I'm also taking all the little scraps from this I-beam that I cut apart and just adding it in there as a little extra detail. And once again, we're giving ourselves a nice healthy dose of that Sprue Goo to help hold this piece down. We're going to be putting that not just on the base, but on the top of that I-beam as well. And it's important to consider the way that we're going to be placing our door here on top of this I-beam. If we put it directly on top of it, meaning like perpendicular or parallel to it, you're not going to get as much height out of it. So if you cock it about 45 degrees, the edge will hang way up in the air. So if you've got a figure that has its foot way up in the air, or whatever the case may be, then that is how you're going to accomplish getting better height. Now moving on to our next one. Now there was probably a lot safer way to cut down this bit for this base, and probably should just rubbed it back and forth on a piece of sandpaper. However, I really wasn't concerned or bothered by using the Dremel in this way, as I have worked with some pretty small pieces in the past at work with a lot more dangerous tools than this, which sounds really bad. But basically, I was confident in my skills and my ability not to hurt myself. Please never use a power tool in a way that makes yourself feel unsafe, because even when you feel safest, there's still a chance you're going to get hurt. So just use caution and do what makes you feel comfortable. But basically, I'm trying to sand this piece down to try and get it to fit relatively flat on the base. I don't want this to be something that's super ever present and like in your face that it's there. I want it to look kind of sunken into the ground. Here you can see me just doing a little test fit to make sure it works the way I think it does and doesn't take up too much space on the base. Unfortunately, because I'm working with a little shoulder pauldron trying to get it all cleaned up and also try to fit it in place, I have fat thumbs. It's hard to see what I'm doing. But I'm trying to figure out how much of that shoulder pauldron needs to get cut off. And I initially think if I cut about a third of it off, maybe it'll work. But it ends up being about half of it. I end up removing a whole half of the shoulder pauldron. So what I'm currently working on right now is converting a skull incense burner from a Nurgle set to be like this gaunt face from a character who has met a quick and untimely demise at the hands of what is probably both a spiritual and energetic weapon of some kind, since it's Warhammer 40k. I'm going to be taking that central hole in its head and kind of opening it up more to make it look more like a impact has created a rather large wound, and then I will be putting lots of blood effect on the ground. So I find myself needing to fill some small voids on this, mostly inside of the chest and up inside of the shoulder. I need it to look as though there's something in there, as well as I also need something to mount this head to. So I'm going to go ahead and just fill that with some gray stuff. This is the same epoxy putty that I've been using. We're just using a different tool than what I've used in the past. This is just a little sculpting tool that's meant for doing things like eye sockets. I find it's really nice to use something like this, especially when sculpting around the neck and head region, just to create a nice little pocket for mounting Games Workshop heads. So if you've ever worked on a conversion before and you've ever had to fill that whole section in with green stuff and it's hard to kind of get the head to sit right, a tool like this will make that a lot easier. My intention with the arm and the shoulder isn't necessarily to fill the whole void, but to make it look as though what remains of the arm is just kind of dangling loose inside of this armor. So I'm kind of just stuffing some stuff up into the shoulder, as well as then tearing it free from the bottom and just kind of scraggling it out to make it look like viscera and leftover, well, forgive the phrase, just leftover meat. I then took a little bit of leftover rod from when we were making all of the bullet casings and just kind of shoved that up in the green stuff. My intention is to paint that later to make it look like a little chunk of bone is hanging out. Now here I'm using PVA glue. This is the same stuff that kids go to school with, so if you remember the white glue from when you were in elementary school, same thing. We're just using some watered down PVA, and I'm going to be using tile grout. And the reason I'm using tile grout is because it's very durable, it's very strong, and it's kind of already the color I want. All I gotta do is add a little bit of a dry brush on top and it's done. I don't really have to do anything to it. However, if you want to go ahead and paint on top of it and do something else, you can totally do that. It's a nice strong canvas for whatever it is you want to do at the end of the day. I then soak the area in rubbing alcohol. You could choose to soak it in water, but rubbing alcohol is going to evaporate faster, it's going to kick off faster, and I'm going to be able to start painting sooner. And with a small area like this, the rubbing alcohol doesn't really affect it, although you may decide you want to just play it safe and use water, but I haven't had any problems with it. I then take some more watered down PVA and I just kind of sprinkle it all over the surface. Again, this is going to help lock everything down, make it nice and solid, and make it so I can paint on top of it. Now I wanted to go ahead and give you guys a baseline, so we're going to paint one of these base toppers. This is just to give you an idea that these do come out looking really nice. They come out looking about just as good as the pre-made ones that you would get from Games Workshop for, say, a named character or whatever. So I'm going ahead and I'm choosing some earth tones. We've got like Fugan Orange, Agrax Earthshade, Seraphim Sepia. It'd be great if I could talk, wouldn't it? And we're just going to kind of take those earth tones, we're going to put them all over, blot them off with a paper towel. We're just going to keep layering it up until we get a really natural stone look. For the manhole cover, I went ahead and used some lead belcher all over. This was just to kind of decorate things up. I'm not trying to make things look overly flashy, which is why when we take Vallejo silver, I'm not doing an all-around edge highlight. I'm just kind of hitting certain places, adding a little pop of color. Same thing with the Aquila. I'm kind of just hitting it all over. I don't end up putting any more washes or any more highlights on top of it because the base is not meant to be the focal point. That's another thing that I want to cover when it comes to painting your bases or making your bases for your army. Your bases are not your focal point. Now that can be the case for like a hero figure. You can totally go all out for that and there's no reason why you can't. But the more detail and the more things you have going on your base, the more it's going to distract from the character that goes on it. especially if that character has not a lot going on. So that's something to also keep in mind when designing your bases for your miniatures is this base going to outshine the miniature I put on it? Now for rust effects, I'm just keeping things simple. I'm using the Vallejo rust effects. They're really nice and watery. If you shake them up enough, they do kind of thicken up, but I just want to use the wateriness that is kind of on top after the paint separates to kind of give this faded, rusted look. Now Army Painter does a paint line for Battlefront miniatures, and this is their brass color. Now this entire paint set is meant for painting scale historic models, but the brass color I really like. It's not the exact same brass color you get though when you just buy their brass color. It's actually slightly brighter. Now moving away from the base toppers, we're getting back into our original full scratch built base here. And I am actually going to be leaving most of this gray. We'll add a little bit of a dry brush of white later on, but you can see we're gonna start out with a dark green and then we're gonna layer up. Now this is going to give it a heavily faded look if you don't completely cover the previous layer. We're also not looking for 100% coverage. So as we work our way up, we're leaving a little bit of the brown behind and then we're leaving a little bit of the dark green behind. And you can take this up as high a color as you really want to. I'm only taking it up 2 layers here, but I'm not really going to tell you the colors I'm using because this can actually be applied to any color you want to use, whether it's green, blue, whatever. The only exception is with yellow, and that's just because yellow is one of those colors that gets very bright very quickly, and I highly recommend mixing a little bit of orange into your base tone, and then you should be okay. Now I'm using Wraithbone here to kind of put a blanket edge highlight across everything. What I mean by a blanket edge highlight is I'm just kind of going through everything. I'm just putting a scraggly edge highlight all over the edge. I'm not really trying to pick out any specific details. I'm just trying to get it on there. This is going to make things look a little bit more natural. Now it's important to use an off-white like Wraithbone. So if you don't have Wraithbone, maybe add a tiny bit of yellow into a pure white and then use that. It'll look more like stone when everything's all said and done. And make sure to kind of touch around and add a little bit of a stipple here and a little dry brush there on any kind of raised surfaces that would be stone. It'll help to make things look a little bit better, and you can even put that on some of the edges of the tiles. Now I'm kind of going back in and I'm kind of lightly repainting up all of the dirt in a brighter brown. I'm leaving some of that dark brown behind and some of the dark brown staining behind because I want this to look as though this is a mixture of rubble between whether it be the building around it is starting to crumble as well as any dirt or things that may have been tracked in or thrown in from explosions that are happening outside. I want this to very much look like a battlefield. Now if you've added any kind of shell casings, go ahead and slap some brass on it and then go ahead and finish off any of the extra accoutrements that you've added to your base here. Now be sure that no matter how you paint it, you kind of paint that similarly. So if you've got ammo pouches on one base and ammo pouches on another, they should probably be painted in a similar color. That way, regardless of whether they're painted to match your miniatures or your friend's miniatures, it still makes sense across your entire army. Some of you were probably wondering where I was going with the hatch door base. I'm actually going to be decorating it up like it's on a snowy frozen planet. So we're going to be doing some snow effects. Now, there are quite a few ways that I do snow effects. This is one of them, and I have not shared this one yet on the channel before. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to mix up some PVA glue into our snow effect. We'll add a little bit of water and we'll just mix it up. Now if you don't have a disposable brush, just use the back end of a paintbrush, the wooden part, the actual handle, and give that a good mix. Now you want it to kind of be a little bit soupy. You want to make sure that it all kind of gets mixed together. You don't want it to be too thick. If it's too thick, it'll be hard to clean off of things, but it'll also be hard to do the effect I'm going to show you toward the end. So it's important to go ahead and put a little bit more water in it than you think you need to. If you think you have put too much water in, you can always add more PVA, and the reason for that is PVA dries clear. And now of all things, we need to set it aside because we need it to start to cure where we need to use it in order for the effect I want to show you guys to work properly. And I know that feels really weird. So we need to set it aside for at least about 2 minutes, upwards of about 5 minutes. and then that's kind of a good place to actually use it. So while we're doing this, we're going to go ahead and paint up the base. Now I am using the hatch door from a previous tutorial, which is why it's already painted. Anything that's not painted in this case, I'm choosing to paint up kind of a rust brown color, and I'll add some more rust effects to it later using those same Vallejo rust effects that we've already seen previously in the video. As well as on the edge of that girder, I'm going to go ahead and add just a little bit of Vallejo silver to make it look like it's a fresh break. You could also go around and add little dots of brown to the door or whatever else you want to make it look like it's been here longer. The more wear and tear, the longer it's probably been in the environment, or the more heavy the explosion it was that knocked it off of the tank it came from. You can also have a lot of fun with how you decide to paint up your tank door or whatever large platform that you have glued down, and paint it up in the same colors as your friend's army. After all, what's a little competition amongst friends? Alright, so once you get everything painted up the way that you want it, and you've given that glue mixture a chance to start to cure, we're going to go ahead and start packing it into our voids and just kind of filling up anything that's underneath this door, maybe a little bit on top and around the door. I'm adding just a tiny bit more snow mixture just because I got my ratio a little bit wrong. You're going to realize that when you go to put it on, if it just kind of flows like water and the snow doesn't really mix in, then you can add a little bit more snow flock to it. But we're going to go ahead and just kind of goop it all in there. Now, you'll notice that my snow mixture is a little bit sparkly. I add a small amount of glitter to every batch of snow flock that I buy. I just like it to look a little bit glittery. I think it kind of adds to that glassy white look that snow tends to have sometimes. In any case, we're going to go ahead and pack this in all around that door, and then we're going to put some on, and then I'm going to share with you the secret of how I kind of get a more realistic effect. So the secret is to just agitate the hell out of the edges. You're going to see me here, I'm just kind of poking around with the brush, tip-tapping it everywhere, pushing it around. The reason for this is that the PVA dries clear. So even though it looks like we have these big huge mounds of this stuff all over, the reality is that the only place it's actually going to be when it dries is the grit. And once you put a sealant on, like a tester's dull coat or something like that, all of that glue just kind of blends in. You don't see where it ends and where it dried. So all you see is the actual texture of the snow. So that's my secret for how to get realistic snow. One of my last little things that I'm choosing to add here is a little bit of edge highlighting with some silver. Now I'm adding this to the door just to give it more aged and more weathered appearance. I didn't add this prior to this because I didn't know where the snow effect was going to end up. And without wanting to put it all over everything and only put it in a select few places, you kind of have to add that now. Back over to our Gory Nurgle base, we're going to go ahead and do a Xandri Dust dry brush across the entire surface. Now you could dry brush in whatever color you want to alter the colors however you feel, or even add washes to it after the fact. It's entirely up to you. And then I'm going to go ahead, and the way that I do Death Guard, or in this case Nurgle, I am going to paint this marine up in that way, starting with a Deathworld Forest. Now, I'm not going to show the whole process because I actually have a video here on the channel about how I do my Nurgle Marines or my Plague Marines, so you guys can go check that out. I'm going to skip forward until I start covering things that I don't cover in that tutorial. And now for one of my favorite products of all time, Blood for the Blood God, which is surprising that it's one of my favorite products of all time because I almost never use it. I'm actually going to be using it pretty heavily here. One of my big shticks about putting blood effects on a base is a lot of times people go way overboard to the point where it's almost comical. It doesn't look real. And although, yes, these are fantasy games, and yes, these are miniatures that we paint, and do most people paint in a realistic paint style? No. But for me, gore needs to look within the realm of real compared to your model. And to spend tons and tons of time painting in a very specific style, and then they just goop tons of this stuff all over your model, or not put hardly any in some cases, especially for like monsters and things where maybe their mouth should be covered in this stuff. It's never really made a lot of sense to me. So I have a very particular way that I like to put it on my bottles, and I'm actually just gooping it all over this time. I am going to put a little bit of splatter around where the blood is pooling, and I'm going to put some splatter around from the arm. I imagine that the injury to the arm probably happened prior to this guy's death. And I also imagine that despite how gaunt he looks, whatever has caused him to look gaunt is something that has rapidly killed him very quickly. And that's why there's still fresh blood on the ground. If you didn't want it to look fresh, I recommend adding a small amount of brown, something dark like a dryad brown or a dryad bark brown, into your blood effect. Just mix a little bit up on a palette and add a small amount of brown to darken everything up. When blood dries, it tends to turn brown on a lot of materials, so just putting a little bit of brown in there and still kind of leaving it red in the meaty areas of the body is probably an okay safe bet, unless this body is really quite ancient, in which case most of the blood would have drained and you'll have that brown all over the ground. And there you have it, guys. 4 distinct different bases, although we did cheat with the one with it being a base topper. But a lot of you guys really seem to like it when I do these basing videos. If you want to modify a base topper, a really quick, easy way to do that is something like a grass tuft, or even printing out some fake little posters that you can glue down just to make it look like a discarded piece of trash, just to kind of help set the scene. In any case, I hope you guys have really enjoyed what I've put together here for you. And if you have any suggestions for future videos, or even just future themes for bases that you'd like to see me attempt, go ahead and put them down in the comments below. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. May your display case always be filled, and your pile of shame never run empty. Until next time.